Okay. All right, I'm Jim Wetzel from Lincoln University. I'm going to be talking to you about feeds and the actual process of feeding those feeds out to particularly fish. This is a very important concept to address when we talk about aquaculture, because feeds and the actual process of applying them overwhelmingly dominate the cost of raising fish. The first thing I'm going to concentrate on is explicitly the feeds themselves. Most of the fish that we feed, we expect to feed them a feed that makes them grow fast. In order for that to work, they have to eat lots of it. On top of that, the feed needs to be of a high quality that provides all the nutrients the fish need. We're going to assume that the feeds that we're discussing here from this point forward are of that sort. Also, when we're considering the feeds are not all the same. They differ on several different levels. They differ in terms of their nutrient contents, specifically in terms of the protein content. And when we talk about protein content, that is more important in dictating the price of that feed than probably anything else in terms of the actual formulation cost or feed making cost. They can also differ in the energy content, especially as that which comes from the fat component of the feed. The feeds can also differ in terms of the size and the nature of the particles it's in. Most of the time when we're talking about feeding fish, we're talking about the use of pellets, round balls or cylinders of some sort that are relatively easy to broadcast or to throw out into a tank or out on a pond or into raceways. But we can also, particularly if we're talking about fish in an aquarium setting, we can be talking about flake foods as well. These are the principal types of feed particles that we'll be talking about, even though there are others beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. On the table here, I'm going to show you several examples of feeds here. Aim down towards this here. Yeah. In the upper row are a series of pellets representing different sizes. The dark coloration indicates that there's lots of protein, particularly that which is coming from animal products, especially fish meal. If you were to smell it, it has a distinctive fish-like smell, which is coming largely from the oils in the feed. Notice the differences in pellet size. As we go from this side to that side, the pellets get larger. Pellet size is very important because big fish cannot easily consume very small pellets. Their mouth is not, and their gill setup are not designed to sort that stuff from the water as they try to go after it. And very small fish have a hard time eating bigger pellets. They can't actually get them in their mouth, or at least they can't swallow them effectively. So oftentimes when we're selecting the feed we're going to use, we're going to be very concerned about its size. And for fish like rainbow trout, which we're going to concentrate on out in the lab, size of the pellets very closely mimics the size of the mouth. If you get too far off in terms of the relationship between those sizes, the fish will not eat as much, or you'll have a lot more waste. And those things we want to guard against. Another thing that you cannot see here with these pellets is that some of them can sink, some of them can sink slowly, and some of them float. Most of the feeds that we have here, especially from here on, they float. In our tank setting, that's not that big of a deal because we can see what's going on. But if you're feeding in a pond, a bigger pond, or especially a pond that's got very murky water, you can't necessarily see what the fish are doing. And the floating pellets help bring the fish up so you can see what's going on. That can be a very important consideration. Again, these are the pellet feeds in different sizes. And this is not all the feed sizes that are out there. There's many, they can be smaller and they can be a lot larger, sometimes as big as a D-size battery or better. Another type or particles type are flake foods. Now, we seldom use these in a commercial setting, seldom. These are used mostly for ornamental fish, but I will say this, folks that know how to feed ornamental fish have a major leg up on how to feed fish in a pond or lake or tank setting. Okay, I'm going to show you some of these pellets here up close. They're relatively uniform in size. That's ideal. If we had pellets of different sizes, that can be a problem that induces waste. What else can we show you here? Notice the differences in color. We don't know if color matters much, but whenever you buy flake food commercially, like for pet feeds, the manufacturers often go out of the way to make it so the feed has different colors. Now, it may not impact what the fish want to eat, but the colors can indicate pigments in the feed that might be important for the fish's health. In some cases, the colors can impart colors on the fish that puts them in what we call breeding dress. Their colors. In some cases, it can promote natural coloration of the eggs and promote better hatchability of the eggs. So there can be advantages to that, especially if the color is coming from the pigments associated with plants, especially the reds and the greens. Okay. Now, let's get it back up on me again here. When we talk about these feeds are expensive. They are very expensive. You can't get feeds currently in the Midwest, at least not easily, that are made here. They're almost all imported. So not only are the feeds expensive to manufacture, but you got transport costs. And then on top of that, when you buy your feeds, you don't use it all at once. And you got the issue of storage. When we store feed, you've got several things you're trying to avoid. One of which is keeping the feed from getting too warm. You need to keep it in an area that's protected from the heat, direct sunlight. Sunlight's bad for feed. You want to protect it from moisture. If it gets too moist, you start to get organisms, particularly fungi, growing on that feed and ruining it. Another concern is insects and rodents. They'll get in there, whatever your storage containers may be, those pest organisms will chew through it and then start to eat your feed. Another problem that you can get into is exposure to air. A lot of feeds, it comes to you in some sort of an airtight container, or it's in bags at least that restrict airflow. You want to maintain that during the bulk of the feed storage life. Keep the oxygen off because it makes some of the components go rancid or otherwise oxidize. It makes them either taste bad or just simply not nutritionally of good quality for your fish. Another thing is age. In the past, or if you're a commercial farmer doing this on a very large scale, and you're trying to keep your feed costs low, you'll be using feeds that you want to use right away, like in 30 days or less. If you're having to buy feeds and you can't afford to get it routinely, you have to get it once in a while, and you have to store it for a while. You want feeds that have a good shelf life. Most of them are good for at least 90 days, and some of the newer types of feed that you can get out there, they can last as long as a year. At least that's what they're being stated to do. And so far, we've not seen anything that refutes that. But storage is a big deal. If you're going to get feed, you got to protect it, like I indicated before. Keep it out of the heat, out of the sun, away from pests, keep the moisture down, and definitely don't get any more than you can use in a time that feed's still good. Okay. Another consideration when we're feeding feeds is the ergonomics of it. When you're actually feeding your fish, and this is where we need to show this little mess here. When I go out to feed my fish, I've got to have a way to transport it, to get it out to where I can actually apply it. When I'm feeding them, I don't know exactly how much I'm going to feed them most of the time, especially when I'm feeding by hand. Or I may have one pond being fed one amount, or one tank and one amount, and another a different amount. So what I do, or I like to do, is take a larger container full of feed and more than I'm going to feed on that particular feeding. And then I have some sort of device like a scoop or a spoon. Let me show you the other setup we have here. It's something like this. If I have a smaller group of fish I'm trying to feed. The bigger container is more or less like a hopper. This is something you actually allocate the feed with. And this way, it enables you to be relatively consistent in the actual amount of feed you put in the pond or in with your fish at a time. Basically, think of it in terms of a mouthful for the fish. This structure also has another role, though, especially in a pond setting. When you're feeding fish, you do a lot of this. You scoop up your feed and you pour it in somehow, or you fling it. When you're feeding your fish, more often than not, you're not just simply dropping it at your feet. Somehow you're dispersing it all over the surface of the water body. When you're doing that, a structure like this makes it so it's a lot easier to broadcast that feed, to get it out there, to get it away from the edge. it's also easier on you physically. If you got to feed a lot and do it multiple times a day, a problem you can get into is this: it wears you out. Repetitive motion. Now, when I'm talking about feed thus far, I'm just talking about the feed, the actual putting the feed in there a little bit. There's also the issue of regimen. There's how much feed you apply. There is how often you apply. Some fish, you feed them once a day. That's it. And if it's really cold, you may not even do it that often. If you got actively growing fish under conditions that are close to optimal, the water's just right for the fish and they otherwise feel good, you may feed them several times a day. With very small fish, you can feed them as often as once or hourly. And most of the time you're doing that during what we consider the workday or during daylight hours, but there's some species of fish where you might even do it at night. But for the most part, the fish that we work with here and that we'll be considering, you'll be doing it during the day. I'm assuming that most people interested in feeding the fish are doing this as a secondary consideration. They might do it before they go to work and also the work day to make it more practical. There's issues also not only in terms of that, there's actually when the feeding takes place. Some fish like to feed during the daytime, some like to feed at night, and others or what we call crepuscular, like to feed early in the morning when the sun's relatively low, and also at dusk when the sun's relatively low. There's also the issue, the fish can learn to feed in different feeding patterns. It takes a little bit of time to train them. Another consideration here with our fish when we're feeding them is the issue of just how fast you do it. You throw it in all at once and just see if they eat it, come back a little bit later to check on them, or you kind of meter it out when you're feeding. That's something that we're going to demonstrate here shortly out in the lab. There's all sorts of fun trying to figure out the fish, how to read them, decide whether to feed them more or less. And that's part of the art of feeding our fish. This can be an art if we're not careful. I'm doing my best to explain this process so it can effectively be a science for us. Okay, what was I going to show else here? Right. That's 20 minutes, isn't it?
13.
13?
Yeah.
13 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So I got a little bit more time to talk about this thing. Another aspect about this feed, when we talk about it, again, I mentioned a while ago that some of it floats and some of it does not. Our floating feed, again, that can be very advantageous to help us see what the fish are doing. But typically, the floating feeds have an ingredient in there that with some fish species can be problematic. A lot of the fish that we raise are carnivorous by nature, and normally they don't experience the consumption of carbohydrates or sugars that much. The feeds, though, that we make that float, they typically have a lot of starch. They're kind of like popcorn. We manufacture the feeds that float. What we do is we have a little bit of moisture in there. We heat it up real good, and then under pressure, and then when it pops out with less pressure, it kind of poofs out just a little bit like popcorn, and it expands enough so its density becomes less than water. So when you throw it out, it floats. Okay, that same carbohydrate, you got to watch out. With some fish, they don't do so well on it. If they get too much carbohydrate in the diet, what you can often expect to see is livers that are oversized. The fish don't want to eat as much, or they'll have fat placed in places that you don't expect it. And they just don't thrive. Fish like some of our bass, bluegill, hybrid striped bass, those fish in particular are problematic with that. Now, another consideration when we talk about our feeds and our fish is that with some fish like channel catfish and rainbow trout, we can get feeds that are made specifically for them because we have a pretty good idea what their actual nutritional requirements are. Most fish species out there, especially those that were raised in the Midwest, we don't know that much. So what we'll often have to do is assume that the feeds already made for other species will work. In our case, we feed mostly bluegill, largemouth bass, and crappie here out in our ponds. And what we're doing to feed those fish is using feeds that are actually made to meet the requirements for trout. And the assumption is those feeds have more than enough nutrients to feed our bass, bluegill, and crappie. But at this point, we don't really know. The downside of that is that trout feeds and the salmon feeds, which are similar, typically are a lot more expensive than feeds that would be used to feed catfish of the same size. But we do know that yes, the catfish feeds, the species of fish it's made for makes a big difference in terms of how the fish perform on it. The catfish feeds for the fish that we have up here, they're more carnivorous. Those catfish feeds generally do not perform as well for us. There are also differences in terms of brands. I can't go into much detail with that, other than that you may have to explore this yourself. But some brands differ markedly in terms of how well they promote the performance of your fish. They can differ in terms of how palatable, in other words, how edible they are as far as the fish are concerned, and also in terms of how they promote fish growth. That's something you have to work at yourself. And another thing that we found out is just because one brand is very good for 25 years does not mean it's the best the next year if the manufacturer changes what they put in or how they make their feed. So you always got to be on your toes with that. It's a learning curve with this, no matter how you do it. I'm just giving you the basics so that later on we can actually get down and talk about how to do it in a more effective manner. We're giving you just the basics. Do we have any questions at this point?
Are there any questions in the chat? If anybody wants to drop a question in the chat.
Yeah, I don't see any in there. I don't see any questions.
No questions in the chat.
Okay, if you think of one, anybody, feel free to just drop it in the chat. And we'll get back to that.
118. Okay, that's.
You're doing great, Jim.
Well, I'm waiting to. I need feedback. I need some questions.
You want to? We can open up the mics. Give me 1 second. I will allow people to turn on their mics. Oh yeah, you can. So anybody, if you'd like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. So we're not hearing any questions.
Okay, let's go ahead and do the good part then.
Okay.
Hopefully it works. Can I talk to you before we go?
Yeah.
Okay, we're getting ready to do the cool part, the part that actually requires the live component of this. We're getting ready to go out in my lab and we're going to actually see how there can be communication between me, the person doing the feeding, and the fish that I'm feeding. You'll be able to see it. I'm going to make a point to show you that. I want you to see how the fish, their behavior changes as they're going from being very hungry through the process of feeding to the point where they say, hey, I don't really want to eat anymore. And then that's going to help you gauge how much effort you put into the feeding process. Feeds are very expensive, but the labor part is also very expensive, especially on a smaller scale of feeding fish. And I'm going to show you how the process works, and I can give you insight into ways that you can reduce your cost of the actual feed effort. In other words, the time you invest. Okay, you ready? Okay, hopefully hold up. Okay, let's go to the feeding room. Oh, we got one. Yeah. Okay. No, it's not seasonally red.
No, we're good.
Okay, we've now moved into a lab where I've got several different tanks of rainbow trout. To start with, we're going to concentrate on 4 tanks that have relatively small rainbow trout that are off to your right. The fish in there should be quite hungry. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the first tank that we have that we're going to be feeding. You're going to see what the fish are doing when they're not particularly excited. I hope you're going to see their change in behavior as I approach the tank. And I'll talk to you about what's going on as we do that. Okay, hang with the tank. Yeah. Hang down. Right to freeze.
Okay, stay right there. Okay, I'm approaching the tank. Hey, kids, see how the fish are moving towards me here? Okay, and they're starting to splash and jump the surface, going after, looking for food. That indicates that these guys are hungry. That's how they're talking to me. My talking to them was just simply approaching the tank. And they also could see this or a bucket. The fish are not total idiots. They can actually learn a few things. They can learn when you're carrying feed, when you're not. They can also distinguish between people. And they can also learn when you're feeding, when you're not. Now, notice the fish are starting to disperse. They figured out that, well, he's not going to throw food in there just yet. Well, we're going to change that, because what I'm going to do is take out a small, consistent amount of feed, in this case, about like this, and I'm going to apply it. There they go. Notice a very rapid change in behavior. Now, when I put the feed in there, I want them to clean it up in less than 30 seconds. Okay, I'm going to do it again. Can you see him eat it? It's on the screen. Okay, when we're putting the feed in there in small amounts like that, I could put a lot more in there at once. The problem you get into is if the feed stays in contact with the water very long, the nutrients it contains starts to leach out, and the pellets start to swell up as well. They become less yummy, less palatable. So we want to keep the feed fresh as far as the fish is concerned, fresh and crispy. Okay, I'm going to pop these guys again. Okay, now I'm going to do these other tanks too. Yeah, step back. Now here in this case, I'm going to follow the procedure we normally do, where I feed 3 tanks at a time. And sometimes you can do 20 or 30 tanks at a time. You just got to keep going back and forth. You get some leg work in doing this. It's good for you. Good for the fish too. But it allows you to keep the food fresh when it's presented. They're most excited. They eat the best when the feed first hits the water. Now, if you watch, their feeding activity is going to slow down. I'm going to say this. For a fish, when you're eating, it's work. You get all excited. You're chasing your food down. It's like you're sprinting. They get out of breath. Okay, they're starting to slow down in this tank. They are slowing down. So I gotta be careful. Let hold the feed. The objective of this game is I'm trying to get the fish to eat as much as they can without overeating. And I also want to do it without spending too much time, because my time is worth money, because I could be doing something else. Okay, I'm gonna have to get my feed here in a minute. Okay, we'll get some more feed. Size. Okay, now see, the pellets are starting to linger longer on the surface. So I'm not going to feed this tank now for a moment. This tank over here is still eating very well. And this tank here is eating pretty good still. Now I'm going to walk back over here and check on these guys. Okay, now I'm going to be careful when I apply, but it's all cleaned up. I'm going to risk putting another feed. Now they're coming after it yet. But they're definitely slowing down. Definitely slowing down. Now, in this case, I'm approaching the tank, even though I may not be putting feed in. I'm still going to put feed in here, though. It looks like they're still pretty hungry. Okay, now here I'm coming back about 30 seconds later, and I'm still seeing lots of feed floating around in here. It's definitely time to slow down. But if you look at them, what you can often see is their bellies start to distend. If we quit feeding them now, their bellies are going to keep getting bigger. That's because after they eat, they keep swallowing water because the feed's dry, and for some reason, they like to drink water to loosen that feed up. And their bellies are going to continue to expand even though we quit feeding. Now see what happens here. That's not very aggressive. It's going to slow down on that. Okay, are they done? Okay. So what you got to do is be able to read when it's time to stop feeding them. We don't want feed also going to the bottom and sitting on the bottom. That's wasted feed. They may eat it still, but you're gonna have a lot of nutrients being wasted. You don't gain by feeding to the point where feed goes to the bottom. Okay, so this group of fish, we're probably done feeding them for the day. I'm gonna do one more, or not for the day, but for this feeding. Let's take a look at their response when I put food in here. Okay, they're still coming at it a little bit. Okay, let's contrast it from far end. These fish here are more or less satiated. That means they're pretty close to full. Now let's go all the way to the end here. It's a fish we haven't fed so we can compare. Look at these guys, they're coming up. These guys are business for food. See the difference? That's how the other tank started off. Okay, and we go back to the other tanks. Let's go back to the other one there again, the far one. That tank was very full, or very aggressively feeding, interested in food. And these guys, they still got feed floating. They're done. They're not coming up for it. I'm going to put a little extra in to see what they do. See, they're not going for it. That we overfed right there, too much. Okay, we want to avoid that. So what you got to do when you're feeding your fish is you got to figure out when they're hungry and give them the feed until they're full. And you got to let them, to a degree, tell you what their needs are, to a degree, how much they want. You got to learn how to read them. It takes practice. The size of the fish impacts things. Also the species. I'm just showing you rainbow trout here. Catfish, bass, crappie, bluegill, they all feed differently. These guys are pretty good. They come up, grab the feed, and go down. Some fish come up and just fling feed everywhere. They feed differently. It's not only the difference in species, the fish size can be a factor, and the temperature of the water. If the water is very cold, the fish can feed very differently than when it's warm. And if the water's too warm, the fish may not want to eat at all. So you got all kinds of factors that impact the way the fish interact with the feed and interact with you. And you've got to learn these depending upon what species you're dealing with. Now let's go over here and move to the bigger fish. Okay. Now here, we've got some larger rainbow trout and a similar number of fish in a tank, but these guys are a lot bigger. And you're going to see, and this tank here is somewhat more realistic because you can't see as well. Now look at the size of the scoop I'm going to be giving these guys. Okay, in this case, I'm just going to fling it out, and here they go. Now these guys are splashing around pretty good. And once in a while, pellet might fling out of the water, which can be problematic. Other species can have a lot more material slip going on. Now here, I can't even see the pellets very well. And the computer's having trouble getting wet. Okay. But we're going to keep feeding these guys. In this case, I'm going to be reading them a little bit different. I can't see the pellets like I did before. So I'm more or less reading the fish based upon their splashing activity. I can't see the pellets as well. So, popping in. And what I'm doing here is I'm looking for, every time I put more feed in there, I want to see a resumption of aggressive feeding activity. Right now, they're feeding good, so I'm probably going to put some more feed in there. It looks like they've got mostly cleared up where they're coming to feed in that tight group is starting to disperse because the food got dispersed a little bit and it disappeared. Now there's no feed here that can feed more, so I'm going to put more in. And that's a pretty good amount. Okay. Now these guys are feeding so aggressively that if you were to measure the amount of oxygen the fish have available to breathe in there in that water, the oxygen levels are going down. And if the oxygen levels get too low, they don't want to eat as much. So when you're feeding your fish, that's one of the considerations you're going to have is what your oxygen concentrations are. That's going to be specific to the type of fish you have, the time of year, and all kinds of fun stuff. Give these guys some more, see if you can feel it flowing out. I mean, these guys are still hitting the feed pretty hard. Okay, gonna pop them in. Okay, now I'm gonna throw some on the far side of the tank and see what happens. Yep, they're still coming up for us. They're getting under. We didn't save them that feed. They are slowing down. Okay, I don't know if you can see this, but their feed intake is slowing down. Take a look over here on the side. Trying to get it. Look here. We don't want to see a bunch of feed like that floating for very long. If it lasts more than a minute or so, then it's time to stop. Okay, they're definitely slowing down the feed intake. They're starting to disperse. They're not. When these guys feed, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and they get tired. You want to get them to eat as much as you can without working them out, without tearing them down and get them tired. Okay, let's do the yeah. Okay, now then for fun, we're going to feed some larger fish. These are also rainbow trout. We're going to feed them a much larger pellet. These are considered larger fish. And you're going to see that their style of feeding is different just simply because they're bigger. These are rainbow trout, same species I showed you a different color. And these, because there's fewer fish in there, I'm not going to use as much. See it? Now, these fish, to me, they feed like porpoises. They go straight in and they go down. Other fish come up and they turn real hard. Depends upon the type of fish you're talking about. Okay, you want to clean up pretty quick. We want to make it so to clean up the feed, also not just because we want them to efficiently use everything you give them. We also don't want to overfeed because if there's feed floating around in the system, it promotes bacteria that you don't want growing. It either promotes disease bacteria growing on your fish themselves, or it makes it so it's your biofiltration, whatever you have system that you have to use to keep your water clean or to keep the pond in good order, working order, naturally, it basically pollutes it. You're putting too much nutrition in there and you can't process it effectively. So we want to make it so that pretty much everything you give those fish is actually consumed and converted into fish, not into other stuff.
We do have a question, Jim.
Yeah.
Age difference in
Each tank. Okay, the 3 lots I gave you, they differ roughly by about 45 to 60 days. The first lot is shoot, I bet they're not more than they're probably 3 months old at most. These are going to be 6 months old at most. That's from hatch. And these are just a couple months older than that. So they're 8 months old in terms of respect to hatch. The bigger ones.
yeah, so follow up.
Okay. I'm going to keep popping these every bit. This additional cost to cool water for the trout. In this case, we're not cooling the water. We're using well water. It simulates a lot of springs that we have here in Missouri. We're not doing anything to cool the water. We're using well water or spring water. Now let's go feeding. When the temperatures are real low, it's the way you evaluate whether fish are hungry or not. It changes. That's something you have to learn, and that's something that your mindset has to change with the seasons. It's the basic same principle. Now notice they're getting a lot slower picking the pellets up here on the side. You see that? They're really slowing down. So I'm not going to give them any more feed at this point. They're done. But I could probably come back again in about 4 to 6 hours and they would be able to repeat just like we did to feed up, to eat. The trick is learning how to read the fish. You got to be able to talk to your fish. And each species is different. They differ by how big the fish is, sometimes what you feed them, and the water temperature and other issues of that nature. And also the quality of the feed. Here, I'm trying to show you how to use a floating pelleted feed, which can differ markedly from whether you apply other types of feed. Here, we're doing strictly hand feeding. Hand feeding is the way that we can usually get them to eat the most, but it's also the most labor intensive. So we're going to cover other methods. Hopefully we'll do that in the future. Using automatic feeders, demand feeders, or a combination of those with hand feeding. We usually do a combination of automatic feeding and hand feeding, which we can talk about later, with fish like trout. We're really trying to push them. When we do feed our fish, we typically feed them 6 days a week, and we let them off on, in our case, on Sundays for labor issues. But the fish probably would benefit by being fed 7 days a week. Okay. We want to go back out there for questions. Look here.
Trying to see if there were any more in the chat. No more. Yeah, if you want to, it's up to you.
We can go out there if they got questions.
I didn't. There weren't any more in the chat right now.
Okay. Okay. Well, they ate all the feed. It's good. Fish fed. Now, when we're done feeding our fish, ideally we put the feed someplace else so it's protected from the elements until we're ready to use it again. Okay. All right. That's a basic breakdown of how you hand feed fish. Okay, and this is the starting point if you're going to move to other approaches. Okay, I've got it. That's it.
Do you have an automatic feeder that you could show while you're
Yes,
in there?
I do. Yes, we do. Okay, this is one of the many types of automatic feeders. This is a belt feeder. This one has a spring on this side that when we pull the belt out, this is the broken. Ready? You pull the belt out like this, and you spread feed out on it like this, and you close the lid ideally, and you got a clock-like mechanism in this box, and it regulates how fast the belt goes back. In this case, the clock, which is dinged up here a little bit, is a 12-hour belt or 12-hour timer. But we also have those that have a 24-hour timer. Most of the time, we like to use 12-hour timers at this point. A feeder like this, you can put almost 5 pounds of feed in. But you can get some that are twice this size, or more than twice that. You can put almost 3 times that amount. Okay, these can be a major labor savers. The problem you get into with automatic feeders of this sort is that some days the fish eat more than they do others. And that sets a stage for you either underfeed them or to overfeed them. And both of them are not the best use of your time. What I like to do is set it up so the feeder feeds them most of what they'll eat. And so ideally, even on a slow day, they'll eat all of it. And then I make up the balance by hand feeding them at the end of the day. That way, I'm really only spending that hand feeding effort once. Okay, when you actually arm the feeders, let's load it, pull the belt back, and put the actual feed in it. When you're doing that, the labor associated is very minimal, pretty quick. It's a lot less than the time it takes to hand feed the tank just once. One feeding a day. Okay, these things here, they cost between $200 and $300 a piece. But they very quickly pay for themselves in the work that we've done in the past with trout and bluegill. Like less than a month.
How many fish would that, like what size of the tank, how many fish would that?
It depends on, well, this
Their age
system
and
here,
stuff.
I can feed 5 pounds of feed a day with just one feeder. And that means I could be feeding a couple 100 pounds of fish. It's not very much. If I want to do a few 100 pounds, I would be using a bigger belt feeder or even 2 or 3 of them. Now, these belt feeders like this, you usually use multiple of them, and they're more often than not used on raceways, or you have them spread out around a pond. That's one way of doing it. Or you can switch over to a different kind of feeder that's like used for wildlife to kind of broadcast the feed out periodically. That's another approach. And those are much larger. They can hold 50 to 100 pounds.
Well, it seems
that
like they
froze.
sure did. I think the video froze.
Yep.
Oh, I'm getting a call coming in. Hold on a sec. Maybe. Well, they had said that this might happen. So I see some people are leaving. I completely understand that. They're going to try to reboot. They said that that would happen, take a couple minutes, 2-3 minutes for them to get back online. In the meantime, we're here and happy to discuss things, things small farm.
Yeah,
Perhaps.
this is the downside of on location broadcasting.
You know, I actually thought it was pretty slick.
It did a really good job. It lasted a lot longer than I was thinking it was going to.
Yeah. It was maybe, yeah, the fish slowing down. I saw that, you know, I saw that from my desk here in St. Louis.
I have a question, maybe you guys can answer while we wait for Jim. I missed it all the feeds that he was talking about, everything has to be bought. He doesn't produce anything.
I think he was talking about things that are largely purchased, but I would imagine that they could be produced. It's just that they're largely not.
Okay.
Do you mean the feed, Nadia?
Like the pellets.
The food that there is.
Oh,
Yeah, I think he was saying that most of the pellets that you can purchase are imported, which is part of why they're expensive.
right.
But you can make, so for other species like chickens and other animals, you can make pelleted feed. So with the right equipment, I think you could make pelleted feed for the fish, but it seems like it's a little bit more complicated.
A while ago, we had talked about doing a project with Dr. Pinero with all of those collected Japanese beetles from the traps and seeing if there was a way to like process the beetles into a pellet. But I don't know whatever actually happened with that, but it seemed like that'd be a neat idea. The other thing I remember learning in permaculture about like ponds, one thing was like planting a mulberry tree or mulberry trees around the pond. So when the, but
So
I mean, that
some
isn't high protein or anything, but it was sort of like a neat concept of thinking, okay, how can we sort of like stack functions of say the mulberry plant. Andrew, you're back.
We're back. Let me flip the camera. There we go. Okay, Jim, you're back live.
Okay. All right, that was our attempt at showing you a few basic concepts about the feeds and also some of the basic components of actually feeding the fish. There are other approaches that can be used with other species and even under different conditions, and hopefully we'll be able to approach those in the future. If you got any further questions, I'm still here for that.
How much do the nutrient requirements of different fish, like how well are they known?
Okay, we've got a couple of groups of fish that are very well known. The catfish, channel catfish in particular, and the salmon is the trout and the salmon. We know very reasonably well what their amino acid requirements are, their vitamins and their minerals. And we also know how well they can tolerate carbohydrates and things of that nature. Beyond that, you've got the issue of protein, which the average person, especially when you're looking at feed bag, that's the part that they're looking at, the protein content, the fat content. Some species that are naturally predatory, and particularly from colder water, they typically have a higher protein requirement than those that come from warmer water, especially those that are not as carnivorous or more omnivorous in their feeding habits. Let's see here. When it comes to the life stage of the fish, generally speaking, the younger the fish is, the smaller it is, the higher its protein and fat requirements are. And in addition to that, the very small fish have a harder time dealing with proteins that are harder to digest. They need to have the higher quality, more digestible proteins in to stimulate good growth in the very small fish. As the fish get bigger, their protein needs go down. Also, as the fish get bigger, the amount of feed they consume per pound of fish tends to go down as well, just like it is in larger animals. The smaller fish, that's where you really got to be on top of your game in terms of giving them quality feed. You mess up there, and you're going to have problems for the rest of that fish's growth. If you don't know that fish, a particular fish's requirement, then use a feed that's richer than you think it needs. That would be my first direction to follow. Some fish, like, go ahead.
Hey, Jim, while you were off, Nadia asked about like making feeds. Do you remember when we were talking maybe with Dr. Pinero about processing all of his Japanese beetles into a feed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've been doing that.
Pardon?
We've done that. We've done all those things.
Okay.
You can make your own feed. The type of milling or equipment that you would use to make your own feed is probably going to be a meat grinder in most cases, to make pellets that are cylindrical in shape.
Okay.
It's kind of like making sausage. The problem you get into with the feeds you make yourself is oftentimes you cannot get the ingredients and volumes that gets the price down. That's a key issue. Another problem you get into is the pellets almost invariably sink. And in most situations, sinking feed's not ideal. And the type of equipment you would need to make large amounts of feed, that equipment's very expensive and it uses lots of power. They're very power hungry pieces of equipment. And then not only do you have the issue of actually mixing the ingredients up, which can be a challenge, and making it into pellets, you've got to also dry it. Remember, when you're storing your feed, you need to keep it dry. Well, when you first make it, it's got way more moisture in it than you want for storage. So you either figure out a way to dry it, which takes a lot of space and ventilation somewhere that's dry, or you freeze it. And that freezing can be a pain as well, especially for feed when you store it in large amounts and forms a big block. But you can make your own feed. You can make it from things like Japanese beetles, which we've done where we had feeds that we made it for chickens in this case.
Okay.
The pellets you make from that have a tendency to become what's called friable. They break up. And that sets that stage so you've got a lot of particles that are too small for the animals to eat readily. So you have to add something else to the feed to make it so it binds better, a binder of some sort. But that can be done. But you also run into the issue of palatability of certain products you might put in the feed. What we did find, like in the Japanese beetle example, is that it's not exactly the tastiest food item for at least the fish we worked with. They're too dry.
Okay, that's really, really helpful. Nadia asks, what do they eat naturally?
The fish?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it depends. The most of the fish that we work with, the salmon, the trout, the smaller bluegill, they eat insects mostly. But all the fish, once they get some size to them, they switch over to being piscivores, eating fish to a larger degree. Some of them will even switch over to eating amphibians and an occasional bird if they can catch it. So they're carnivores, and then most of that's dominated by fish and what they actually consume. They are predators. Most of the fishes that we work with the most. We've got several other species of fish that we don't work with that much, that are much more omnivorous, or some of them even herbivorous in their feeding habits. But again, we're not working with those at this point in time. The closest one that you might encounter, that you might raise in a pond setting, would be something like the grass carp. They do not do well on feeds that we raise other fish on. But they do pretty good when you feed them Timothy pellets and alfalfa pellets. It's mixed in with other feed.
That sounds good. Thank you.
So one more, you mentioned carp. I know that
Yeah.
carp is pretty invasive species and it's in rivers, but is that, have you tried growing them in a pen?
Yes. Yeah, we've had some commercial producers in the state of Missouri that were raising them for sale as a food fish. And what they were doing is, for the most part, they weren't even using feed. They were basically planting winter wheat and alfalfa in a pond, and they were flooding the pond slowly, and the fish would graze on it as the pond filled. And once the pond was full of water, then they switched over to feeding them alfalfa pellets. The fish pellets were too rich, apparently, but you could do that. But no one, to my knowledge, is doing that on a routine basis, because that particular market that those folks were going after was interstate, across state lines. And it's very hard to market the carp across state lines like they were doing. But if you're marketing them locally within your state, that's a different ballgame. We got to find people who want to do that.
Thank you.
Let me put a plug in for the grass carp. They are a very good eating fish. I mean, I would put them up there with walleye. They're very good eating.
Thank you.
Do you have cannibalism issues with fish of the same size?
Sometimes. It depends upon the species you're talking about. With our rainbow trout and our bluegill and crappie, not so much. With our bass, you got to define same size. Sometimes even a 25% difference in size can lead to cannibalism. If you're working with something like walleye or muskie, if you were doing a major piscivore like those, sometimes a smaller fish will attempt to eat a larger fish, and that results in the loss of both. Yeah. And then when you have cannibalism getting underway, it can very quickly take 1,000 fish down to 10 fish very quickly. And that 10 fish is worth not even a very, very small fraction of what the 1,000 fish would be worth. You want to avoid that. That's not a function necessarily of the food quality they have. It's just simply your size variation you start with and what are the fish are actually eating the pellets or the feed you're providing. Something that I omitted from this purposefully is I'm making the assumption that when you're feeding fish pellets, they will either do so naturally or they have been trained to do so. Some of the fish that we work with, like largemouth bass and crappie, we actually have to train them to eat pellets. They don't do it naturally. Other fish like our rainbow trout and catfish, they'll do it from day one. It's natural to them. And that's yet another part of the package when you're trying to raise fish. And those that you have to feed train, those you train to eat pellets, those are the ones you got to watch the most for cannibalism.
How difficult is it to train them to eat pellets?
Anybody can do it. What you have to have is a setup in which to do it. You need to have a relatively large number of fish. I'm talking hundreds, if not thousands of fish at least. You can do smaller amounts, but to make it worth your while, you need to have a larger number. You need to be able to pack the fish into a relatively tight volume so it restricts their movement. You need to make it so you have a relatively high rate of water flow through whatever the containment they're in so that you can keep the water quality high, because you're going to be feeding them lots of food. Now, a lot of the food that you give them at first, they're not going to eat, and that's going to contribute to the water getting nasty. Secondly, when you have the fish really packed in like that, they can't see what's going on around them clearly. And it sets up so if anybody even pecks at something novel coming in, they start to get competitive and want to race at it and go for it, even though they may not see what it really is. And that facilitates getting the fish to eat for the first time as well. And secondly, that feed train process, you want to make it so that they start to associate you, the person, with the feed. It gets that communication going on. If we were to go out to my ponds right now, if we were approaching the ponds, the fish would actually swim from one side of a quarter acre pond to the other and sit there waiting for it to throw food out. And if somebody will do it, you can actually see the water satiate in the pond if there's a lot of fish in there. It's a learning curve. While fish that are not eating pellets would avoid you.
Can you buy fish that have already been feed trained?
Yes, you can. There are fish that, particularly largemouth bass and hybrid striped bass, when you purchase those fish. More often than not, if the fish are any larger than 2 inches long, they have been trained to eat pellets. And generally there's a premium placed on that because there's a bit of labor that goes into it. Usually you've got someone that's investing close to 2 weeks to a month just feeding the fish, training to eat. So yeah, but you can get them. But for some people, because of that costless fingerlings, it might be smarter to feed train the fish themselves. It's something you might need to learn how to do. And it can be done to learn how to do it.
Can it be done in a pond or does it need to be in like a?
Some fish you can do it. Some fish you can do in a pond setting, like type hybrid striped bass. But when you do that, there's inherently a large amount of size variation in the fish with those. They got it even before you start feed training. That's a problem with them. Ideally, you'd grade them first. Other fish like the crappie that we've worked with and the largemouth bass, it's handled better to bring them inside to feed train them. It gives you more control. It keeps them packed in. You can't pack them into that degree in a pond setting. Some of the fish will actually avoid where you're applying the feed in a pond setting, and those fish will never go on feed and they'll be problematic later.
Nadia asks, when is a good time to visit your facilities?
We can be here 7 days a week. So you tell us when you want to come in and we'll do our best to be here. And we're here year round because we're here taking care of the fish anyway. And we do tours anytime.
Because I think I asked that because I think it was great to see what you show and people can see, but it's nothing like seeing it in person. So I would encourage people that are listening to talk to you.
I'm going to stress something very clearly here. When I bring my aquaculture class in, or I bring farmers in to teach them how to feed, I actually have them do the feeding themselves. And I do it more than once during the course of a day. It's more of an interactive thing. They learn some of the details of how to handle that feed. They learn what to look for in terms of the feed size relative to the size of the fish they're doing. There's a lot of that actual hands-on that's far better than what I could show you with a video.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure you would.
Yeah, we bring in farmers, even high school groups, and to actually work alongside us for a day or more to learn how to do these activities. It's not just feeding. We've taught them how to handle fish, how to process fish, how to set fish up to spawn, how to handle larvae. These are all different activities. There's some tricks to it.
And I remember one time we talked about you were looking for volunteers and high school students were a problem that they wouldn't allow high school students to volunteer, but you can have partners.
Yes. Well, we can have farmers, but not high school youth. Yeah. It has to follow under extension to do it, but we can't have them working on research projects mostly.
Got another question. Dan asks, have you converted all the tanks to trout? He said when he visited 3 years ago, your focus was on sunfish.
No, we've only converted roughly about 25% of our facility to trout at most. We're getting ready to do a similar volume of our facility. Will be raising prawn, but the balance of it's raising bluegill, black crappie, and black bass. A fair portion of our fish, though, are also raised now exclusively in ponds.
Want to give them your email address and your best phone number?
Okay, the address, if you need my email address, we need to write it down there.
I can put it in the chat.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you, Miranda.
And the best number to catch me on is my cell phone.
Okay. And what's that?
573-644-3474.
Okay.
Just one last thing, Jim. The one time you served in one of the events that we had a deep fried fish. That was something.
Mm-hmm. Which fish were you talking about?
It was one that it was deep fried, so you can eat the whole thing.
Oh, okay. In that case, okay, we don't feed those fish pellets. Those were brook silver sides. We were eating the fish in their entirety. Those fish were, when we're feeding those, we're making sure they have a lot of plankton to eat. And that's a different, we're actually promoting a natural food web in the pond for those fish. They feed very low in the food chain. You're eating the fish, the entire fish. And you're also, they don't have to get very big to eat them. Most of the fish that we're feeding pellets to, they have to get to a relatively large fit age and size before we can process them. And that inherently builds in a lot of waste. Those brook silver sides, we can harvest them multiple times a year the way it looks. And you don't feed them a lot of actual feed. When we're feeding them, I'm throwing hay out there. And that's about it. That's a different game. You're not even feeding them directly. You're just simply making the revving up the food chain. It's like fertilizing a pasture.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see any more questions in the chat.
Two oh two.
Yeah. Do you have anything else you want to discuss?
Well, at some point, I would like to show folks how to actually feed train. There's a few tricks to it, and it's something that we can actually demonstrate on how to do a relatively small scale. I would love to bring in some fish like crappie and show you how to do that, because there's more to it than just putting them in a container to feed train them. There's also the process of putting them in and how you do it. There's a few tricks to it to make it so it sets a stage for it to be successful. There's the issues related to the automatic feeders we were talking about, how to actually operate those. There's some tricks to it to make it cost effective in terms of your time. There's ways to make it so that you don't spend all your time, makes it so less likely that your feeding setup falls in the water, reduces those odds, and also keeping things like raccoons out and issues of that nature. What else could we do in regards to feed? We can even go through and demonstrate how to make feed. For some folks out there, you might want to make feed that's special for promoting the fish to spawn, putting more fats or vitamins of some sort in there. Or if you're trying to make your own feed, like let's say you're trying to do something organic, there may be some, if I can demonstrate to you the process with the ingredients that I have, then you can turn around and use your process with the ingredients that you have, or the same process with your ingredients. We can do things of that nature. Oh, there's other things we could talk about when it comes to feeding in the ponds. We didn't broach this at all, but there are things after you apply the feed to fish in a pond that can promote feed being lost, where they can't consume it because it gets blown out of the water to the side of the pond or something, or the wrong fish are getting at. There's tricks we can use to keep the feed where it needs to be, and in some situations, excluding fish from it. Like let's say you got grass carp in there, you don't want them to eat your pellets because they can't convert it anyway. There's tricks you can use to keep them away while the other fish of interest can actually get to it. Grass carp. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Picture of grass carp. Yeah, grass carp if you want to see it. These are very good eating fish. They grow very fast, and they don't have to have the high-powered feed. And you can actually grow them with other fish, so long as the other fish aren't slow enough to find their way to the grass carp's mouth. Grass carp may eat plants and the like, but they will consume fish that they can get in their mouth.
It was hard to see. What fish was that?
Grass carp.
Oh,
Yes, it's an exotic, but they're established, so we might as well make use. You got a picture? Can you see it?
yeah.
Are they marketed under a different name?
White Amur is the name that I see for it. Whenever you use the term carp, when you're trying to market fish, carps in the United States is not an ideal name.
Right.
White Amur is where I've seen it, and that way you can get around that. It's like with some of the fishes that we're selling, like our those yellow trout that I showed you in the room. Those are in the trade, those are called golden trout. But when we're trying to sell them, we call them Osage orange trout. It's a unique name, we got a different color. And we're selling them alongside rainbow trout, which is the same species and everything. That we sell the Osage orange trout fish faster and for a higher price. I mean, we sell out the golden trout, those Osage orange trout, I'm sorry, very quickly. And
Now,
they're not.
Is this your direct sales at farmers market?
Yes, direct sales at the farmers market is where we're doing those two species or types together, but we also sell at restaurants too, or one in particular.
Okay.
Right now, we're having troubles keeping up with our sales big time. We're
Okay, that's great.
Demand is
the
high.
demand is higher than what we can meet. That's partly because we can't grow our fish fast enough. And at the moment, we've got issues that deal with the regulations associated with processing. But even then, we're selling more fish. I would like to expand out to more farmers markets to show more people what the products are.
Mhm.
And we aren't raising enough fish to enable that.
It just seems like, you know, aquaculture has just a higher barrier of entry.
It does, a very high barrier.
Right.
We've got a farmer down by Tuscumbia, which is south of here, about 45 minutes. And they're sitting on a bunch of fish right now that they want to sell, but they're having troubles getting someone that even knows how to do the inspection for the processing.
Okay.
The folks that work for their county that deal with inspections are not familiar enough with it. And that alone is a holdup for them.
That sounds hard.
That's a challenge. And you also get into problems like when our location is based in Cole County, and we sell at the Lincoln University Farmers Market, but we also sell in the Boone Farmers Market in Columbia, which is in the county of Boone, and is in the county or the town of Columbia. And we have to deal with the rules of both of those entities there that differ from those in Cole. And that's another challenge you get into, knowing the rules. And even there's the interpretation of the rules, even within office, you got to be concerned with. We're seeing that now.
Yeah, well, you're learning lots of good lessons that we can pass on to people.
Yeah.
Just want to say that Dan said, thank you for doing these. I hope you continue to do these, and I'm double booked, so I got to run. But that was from Dan.
Okay. Anything else?
I don't know. I mean,
Any other questions?
I don't want to get into it too much because we got others of these we could do a better job with and be a little bit more focused on. Feeds and feeding, the feeding part's very broad, actually. I just tried to focus on a very narrow part just to get the conversation started and to work out the technique to present it.
no, I thought that it was really good that it worked out to be in the lab and see the critters. Yeah. So thank you for sticking to your guns on that one. And yeah, I think it added a lot. If there isn't anything else, if as Ms. Yvonne Matthews says, all hearts and minds are clear, then we can say thank you all to our attendees, the committee members who are present here on this this Zoom, including Ms. Susan Jaster, Dr. Neverete Tyndall, and Dr. Tatiana Fisher. Thank you, as well as Jim Wetzel, who served on our committee. Andrew, we thank you for help with all this tech.
You're welcome.
And Augie.
And August Tempe.
Yeah, great job. Thank you all.
Good job. Okay, well, we are going to call it. You all get out there on this beautiful day, and we'll see you again soon. You take care.
Everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.